and welcome to another episode of PTR Perspective. My name is Zainab Imran and I will be your host. Today's episode delves into the topic of e-mobility, discussing government plans, targets, incentives, and what we're seeing in terms of supply. So we will touch upon current and upcoming technologies, discuss bottlenecks and challenges, and establish what we expect 2030 to look like. We've got some very interesting discussion in store for this episode, and to discuss those intriguing and expert insights, I have with me today Maciej Mazur and Efra Osmani. Maciej is the Vice President of the European Association for Electromobility and also the CEO of the Polish Alternative Fuels Association. Efra is the lead analyst for the e-mobility segment at Power Technology Research. Maciej, Efra, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having us, Zainab.
Great, so happy to have you. Now, across the board, across every industry segment and sector today, we see the world transitioning towards greener technologies and reducing carbon emissions. And when it comes to transportation, the movement is here. It is happening. Vehicle electrification is happening. EV penetration is ongoing, and EV infrastructure is spreading across the globe. And as every century, or in fact, every decade is remembered for a defining aspect, an invention, or a drastic change in the way of life, the 21st century, or more specifically, the 2020s leading up to 2030, I think, may well be remembered for the rise in new energy vehicles. So much so that they're no longer an introductory invention, but increasingly becoming a public and common way of life. And motivating this transition, we have statistics like the International Energy Agency's figure of 24%, signifying the contribution of the transportation sector towards global CO2 emissions. And as the need of the hour, we have alternative technologies like battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. And to sustain their penetration into the market and support their regular usage, a reliable and accessible charging infrastructure is essential. So the way we can drive around our regular internal combustion engine vehicles, knowing that, whenever we run low on fuel, we'll have a petrol station somewhere within arm's reach to refuel at. We need to create that same sentiment about electric vehicles so that their usage can be supported and the natural range anxiety surrounding them can be lessened. And for this, most notably around the world, we see the bipartisan infrastructure law passed in the US. So that's going to help accelerate the deployment of public chargers in the country. In Canada, we have the Zero Emission Vehicle Infrastructure Program. So that's a 5-year, $222 million funding ending in 2024. In Germany, we saw $226 million fast charger funding and $133 million AC charger funding. In the UK, we're seeing 1.9 billion pounds being targeted towards private on-street and public chargers. So these are just a few examples of government programs. And mind you, this movement is global. So it's not something that's just happening in the US or China or Europe. Now, I'm going to start off the discussion today with you, Maciej. So leading the European Association for Electromobility and the Polish Alternative Fuels Association, what are your 2 cents on the importance of government incentives up till now to drive the EV market? Why do they matter moving forward? And what impact do policymakers intend to have with them moving forward?
Thanks a lot. And once again, it's great to be a part of this podcast. Thank you very much for your kind invitation. I think that that's a great question, and partly you answered how important it is to support the fact that we need to see the change happening. And obviously, this change is being made by the governments, or here in Europe, it's being made by European Union as well. Obviously, the first step is to be somehow encouraged by the governments to make this first step. And that's why all what is happening on the central level or here on the European level is so important. And that's why we've got here in Europe a Green Deal package. That's why we've got Fit for 55 package. And based on that, our governments in countries all across Europe are setting up their very own acts, which are setting up the whole market, e-mobility market or a new mobility market. So incentives and the governmental support is crucial here. It's absolutely crucial because we need to make this first step, and it's happening all around the world, as you mentioned. The same is happening in United States. The same is happening in China. The same is happening here in Europe. And obviously, after some years of being somehow helped by the government, the market will be in the period that we will not need incentives anymore, but still we need them to make this a huge change. So they are absolutely crucial, and we have seen it in states during Trump's administration. We've seen that the numbers of electric vehicles were much lower than during Biden's administration. So we can see how it's changing. We have seen the same about China. China during the first year of COVID, they changed their policy, and that's why the numbers were even lower than in Europe. In Europe, we are following the same regulations from the very beginning, and we are not changing them. We are making them even much more important for us, and they are being much tougher. CO2 emissions standards as an example. And that leads us to the fact that last year, 20% of total registration, when we are counting the whole market, new vehicles, are battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. 20% it's quite a huge number, because in 2019 it was around 3 up to 4%. So that's why how important it is.
Yeah, and that definitely shows that the outcome that you're trying to achieve with those incentives. So we see that happening, and they're actually impactful and steering the market in that direction. So I absolutely agree. And logically, our expectation of the future is fed by our understanding and observations of the past. So Efra, I want to turn to you here and ask, where have we seen similar examples in recent years of these incentives and grants where they've played that vital role in expanding that infrastructure? So Maciej gave us great insight when it comes to Europe. He talked about the US a little bit as well. Efra, do you want to add to that? Give us some more recent examples.
Absolutely, Zainab, and very correctly pointed out by Maciej that government funding and government investment is very crucial for EV charging infrastructure. So I'll start by the example of the very famous German KfW bank funding for the residential chargers. The funding was of 900 euros per charge point, and for AC chargers of 11 kilowatt. So the initial funding, which was announced back in November 2020 of 500 million euros, it was completely exhausted by June 2021, and around 620,000 charger applications were approved against it. So the government actually then instilled more 300 million euros funding. If we see the total chargers applications that were approved against it, those amounted to almost 1 million charger applications. And the total funding amount was a whopping 800 million euros. Another interesting example would be from South America, actually. Even though we have seen that the region has not really been up to pace in the electrification, but aggressive government policies for the electrification of commercial vehicles and investments from the utility companies such as NG and NL has led to rapid electrification of public transport in South America. So in 2021, Chile had the second highest number of electric buses after China. The utility companies provided a role of financial agent and the energy provider for the transport operators, and invested up to USD 70 million for the adoption of electric buses and the charging infrastructure. So these kind of examples really do give us insights into how investments and grants will play a significant role in moving forward, as well as Maciej also discussed earlier.
Yeah, so that's fantastic. And one other thing that I'm going to
Sorry, one more thing, if I can add one more thing, because we are speaking about many different countries. So let me use an example of my very own country, so Poland, because
definitely go ahead.
We are here doing the same actually. So we are supporting infrastructure development. We are supporting electric vehicles as well. And I can give you an example that in January this year, we launched a subsidy program for the infrastructure, $75 million just to be spent on DC charging stations, 150 kilowatts or more. And it took us just 2 weeks to get rid of the whole budget. So just 2 weeks, and there was starting from 75 million, zero million to be spent on this market. So yeah, those subsidies are absolutely crucial, and the same is about electric vehicles and electric buses here in Poland. I think we are a very good example how the whole market is changing in the zero-emission public transport sector. It's changing rapidly. Right now, we've got 700 electric buses on our roads here in Poland, and that's because just last year, 2 billion zloty, so it's about, let's say, 3 up to 400 million US dollars was being spent on supporting electric buses. So yeah, we are in the moment that it's highly needed, but we can see that it's working.
I kind of want to go back and ask, so the funding that you've just mentioned, you said that it was gone so quickly, the subsidy funding. How many units, do you know how many units actually went on to being installed from that funding?
They're gonna be installed actually, because it's a very, very long process to have those charging stations working actually. But yeah. I think it's in total, it's gonna be about a couple of thousand new charging points, and it's just a part from what it's needed, because one of our projects is called Polish E-Mobility Outlook, and in this outlook we are forecasting that in just a couple of years, from 4,000 charging points we are having right now, not a very big number, we will need to have 40,000 charging points public accessible. So we can see that there is a huge gap between what is right now and what is needed in just a couple of years. We are counting that's the number we should have around 2025, 2026. So yeah, the markets will be changing significantly.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and sorry to cut you off, Zainab. Actually, I think that is really pleased to see this another example from Poland. Actually, I was also looking at the plan of Poland, in which, the National Fund for Environmental Protection and Water Management, they actually allocated 870 million PLN for the charging infrastructure in the country. They're also investing in the power grid infrastructure, but these plans really, affect the charging infrastructure, and it helps in its expansion.
Absolutely. So I'm not going to steer that discussion a bit. So we see that there are these incentives, they're impactful. We're getting chargers out there. We're motivating people to get EVs. When can the market be considered sustainable enough to remove these government incentives? What are some key things to look for? What are some important benchmarks to attain? At which point we can scale back these incentives and think, okay, the market will grow on its own now. So what should we look for?
It's pretty difficult to answer this question, because there are different markets and there are different needs. I think we've got, for example, the discussion in Norway happening even right now, because the market there is on the level of 70 up to 80% of registrations of new vehicles are battery electric ones. So I suppose there we can have the discussion if all incentives are needed, or we are in this moment that we can get rid of some of them, at least some of them. Here in Poland, we are on the totally opposite in the totally different moment, because we are at the very beginning. So right now we do not have here this kind of discussion, because we need to support this whole market, infrastructure market, vehicles market, to make it bigger, and then when it's going to be much bigger, we will decide whether it is responsible to get rid of some incentives. I think that we are getting closer and closer to the moment when incentives, for example, subsidies for purchasing electric vehicles, will not be needed, or they will not be as high as they used to be or they are right now. Because what we are seeing is that vehicles are getting more expensive in general, but ICE vehicles are getting more expensive much faster than electric ones. So the price gap between ICE and BEV vehicles, it's getting smaller and smaller. So I suppose that in a couple of years, let's say around 2024 up to 2026, we will have this moment that that electric vehicles will be the same price as ICE vehicles, and that's gonna be a very good moment to decide whether we should get rid of subsidies and other incentives. It's all depends of how many vehicles will be on our roads. For example, here in Poland, 20 million vehicles and just 20,000 battery electric vehicles. We can see that still this moment is quite far away in our case. So I suppose it's a very difficult question that should be answered individually. Every single market should be asked the same question and should think about the answer. I think that still in the 20s we'll be facing huge need to support infrastructure development and to support vehicles in terms of having subsidies as well.
I'm going to take the discussion a little bit away here and go towards, automotive OEMs. So we're talking about putting vehicles out there. It makes sense to talk about what our automotive and EVSE manufacturers are doing. Now, in recent years, we've seen a plethora of automotive OEMs announcing their electrification targets. So Jaguar wants to phase out internal combustion engines by 2025. Ford wants to do the same by 2030. And virtually every automotive OEM has lined up similar targets and even promised numbers of new models that they want to put out by 2023, 2025, 2030. Let's just take GM, for example. So General Motors wants to deliver 400,000 EVs in North America by the end of next year. And they plan to do this by releasing 20 new EV models through 2025 in the US and 10 additional ones for global markets. Now, where there are EV OEMs picking up the pace, obviously we need to have EVSE manufacturers doing the same. So Maciej, I want to know, do you think that EV and EVSE manufacturers will be able to supply the required numbers to meet the targets that they are setting out for themselves?
I think they will have to, but that's another very difficult question because we are answering this question in a very difficult moment for the automotive industry. And after COVID pandemic, we had semiconductor crisis, and right now we've got war that is happening in Ukraine, and it means that we are facing huge supply chain losses, and those supply chains are being interrupted. So it's pretty difficult to answer this question in 2022 because I'm sure that OEMs were ready to deliver so many electric vehicles, but right now they are facing so many smaller and bigger obstacles and challenges that it's very difficult to say whether they will be able to deliver any kind of vehicles right now. So I suppose that as the first crisis, COVID pandemic, helped a little bit in mobility. The same about semiconductors. I suppose we can say that still e-mobility was not has not suffered so much from semiconductor crisis as the other part, the bigger part of the automotive industry. I suppose the same about crisis we are facing right now. But it's pretty difficult whether we'll be able to manufacture so many vehicles. And for the OEMs, it's as important as for the market, because delivering hundreds of thousands vehicles means that they will have a margin to earn on those vehicles. Without it, they'll be losing. So I'm quite sure that that's their top priority right now, but it's a very, very difficult moment. We are discussing the subject, so I keep my fingers crossed that it's going to happen, because all OEMs have very ambitious plans, and I think all those plans have to be supported, but it's a very, very difficult moment to say that we are sure that it's going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's what we're hearing, and that's what we're looking to see unfold. So we're still waiting to see what happens. But I want to come to discuss what's in front of us right now. So Ifra, can you tell me, where have we seen companies fail to meet these targets?
So there was this case of Tesla. So Tesla has repeatedly delayed the delivery of their electric semi-truck, originally which was planned to be delivered by the end of 2021. But it was delayed, and now we expect that it will be delivered by the end of 2022. And that was due to the supply chain issues and limited availability of the battery cells. Recently, we just saw that Mercedes underwent the purchase of carbon credits in order to avoid the carbon emission penalties for their emission levels in USA and China, failing to meet those greenhouse gas emissions level by 20 to 25%. So these are some of the examples of the vehicle OEMs from the recent past which have been not able to basically meet their goals and targets of electrification. And definitely it goes back to the hurdles and bottlenecks that the OEM industry is facing right now.
Yeah, so that ties in absolutely to exactly what Maciej has explained. And I'm going to stay on that for a little bit and ask, so yes, we have supply chain issues, but just on the whole in this industry, Maciej, can you tell me generally, what are the bottlenecks and hurdles that we're facing?
I suppose the biggest one is obviously charging infrastructure. It's the first and the second and the third top priority for us. I suppose that we know how to use electric vehicles. We are happy to use them, but we need to have places where we can charge them. And for sure, we'll be using mostly charging points at our homes or in places where we work, but still we need public accessible charging stations, and that's the biggest challenge, I think, and that's the biggest challenge in the USA, in China, and in Europe, and when we are looking in the Europe, in the same about Poland, the same about Germany. So I think that maybe apart from the Netherlands, there is no country in the world that can say right now that they do not need any more charging stations, because they are absolutely fine with the number that they've got. As I mentioned already, example of the Polish market, we need 10 times higher number in just 3 up to 4 years. So that's the biggest challenge we are facing, and I think that other challenges are relatively smaller than the infrastructure, because the infrastructure is such a big one.
Completely agree with what you just said. The other very important reasons that I think hindering the growth of EV adoptions is the lack of consumer awareness on the topic. So we continuously hear the terms of range anxiety, and also what is the understanding around the ease of use of the chargers. I think all of these factors really, sum up and and hinders the buyer to make an informed decision while they're purchasing a new car. Another reason, which Maciej, you also touched upon earlier, was the price difference between the ICE vehicles over EV. So we know that currently right now EVs do charge more than ICE, and because of that price difference, we see some people don't have the option of choosing the EV. There's a very interesting case of the second-hand cars as well. We know that Eastern Europe, they do have a lot of second-hand cars usage, and this was very interesting case in France actually, that they announced funding of around €1,000 for the purchase of used electric vehicle in the country. So I think that with the funding on the used electric vehicle, it will also basically entice people into buying electric vehicle rather than a diesel car. We can expect people from the Western Europe particularly to be replacing their first electric vehicle. So that will be very interesting that, we will now have a proper second-hand car market of electric vehicles, which people can definitely benefit from.
Yeah, I think it's a very, very important point. I can give some other examples that, for example, the same subsidies scheme is working in Lithuania, the same in the Netherlands. So yeah, we need to create the second-hand market of electric vehicles, because right now we cannot see a lot of used electric vehicles because of the very, very obvious fact that that's a very, very young market, and we do not see a lot of second-hand electric vehicles. But we will see in the future, and for sure we need to be sure that they will be a part of for example, Polish market, because here in Poland, I'll give another example coming from Poland. We are registering every single year around 500,000 new vehicles and 1 million used ones. So that
is a big market
that
for
is
Poland.
how important it is. And I would like to add one more challenge. I suppose that we will not have time to go through this subject, but just to mention that we are speaking today about passenger vehicles, but we are facing a huge challenge in the field of electric trucks and heavy-duty vehicles in general. And those are real challenges, because when we are speaking about infrastructure for trucks, it's a completely different story than when we are discussing infrastructure for passenger vehicles, and that's a very, very big challenge. But it's happening, and it has to happen in the very, very near future.
Yeah, and over in the US, I mean, we're seeing so many fleet charging projects coming forward. So it is challenging, but it is happening, and it's a great opportunity in the market as well to step in and electrify our fleets. Now I want to talk about the power grid. So naturally, the power grid is a big portion of the EV charging infrastructure. So figuring out how to accommodate EVSE and EV adoption alongside the existing power grid, that's one of the greatest challenges naturally. So what is being done to integrate EV charging into the power grid quickly and effectively without burning the grid? So I'm talking about load distribution here. I'm talking about things like V2G. And Maciej, with you touching on that, I also want to know what you believe should be done. So what's being done and what do you think should be done?
What's happening right now in the UK in the field of having this bigger discussion about not only infrastructure but about the whole energy industry, because we should see it as a kind of an ecosystem in which electric vehicles will not be only the ones getting energy from the grid, but as well will be a part of the grid in the future. You mentioned vehicle to grid, that's absolutely at the very end, but before vehicle to grid, we've got the whole smart charging idea, and in the smart charging, I suppose we should see the huge potential, how to use the grid wisely, how to use the grid in a way that it won't be affected too much by electric vehicles. And in the future, we should consider electric vehicles as a part of the grid, being able to give sometimes energy when it's needed, and take it when it's, for example, cheaper. So I think that it's a huge discussion, and that's a very big challenge. And when we are thinking or we are speaking about the revolution, I think that's the proper revolution, not what's happening right now to change ICE vehicles to electric vehicles, but to change the whole ecosystem in a way that will be able to add something to the energy grid, not only to use from it. And I suppose that in a moment in which we are right now, and I'm from Warsaw, so there is war just next to us, and it's happening in Ukraine. So when we are speaking about being independent in terms of energy supply, it's a very important issue, much more important than it used to be 1 month ago. So I think it's a huge challenge that is in front of us, and it's still, I would say, not a lot has been done, and there are some pilot projects in Denmark, in the UK, in the Netherlands, when we are trying to use vehicle to X, vehicle to grid, but still, I suppose that's the very, very big challenge, but it's a very, very big chance for the whole energy sector to be somehow independent, and to give this connection between automotive industry and energy industry. And that's the first time when we see this connection being possible.
And I just wanted to add a small point over here. So actually, I think Poland has been one of those countries who have recently invested in basically preparing their power grid for the electric vehicles. So I think just some time ago there was this funding of 1 billion PLN was announced by the National Fund for Environment Protection and Water Management, in which they, of course, they were funding this much of huge investment in basically preparing the grid for the EV charging infrastructure. These kind of examples are I believe that we need to see more to make our grid really prepared for the changes that EVs are to bring.
That's interesting, and that's where we see governments incentivizing and wanting this to happen. I'm kind of curious where utilities come into this mix. So where do utilities stand on this, and what are they doing for this movement?
Oh, they are crucial here, absolutely crucial.
No doubt, yeah.
They are the most important part of this ecosystem, and hopefully they are getting much more concerned about the immobility, and they are, I suppose, even interested in being a part of it. So a couple of years ago, I suppose it was just a problem because there were just a couple of electric vehicles and no one really believed that it's going to be a real market. Right now it's a real market, and I suppose for utilities it's a chance as well. And we've got quite a lot of members from this industry, and I suppose right now it's a huge chance for them as well, and it's going to be a very, very big part of their business. Speaking about what we'll see in the market in the 30s, for example.
Yeah. Now, throughout our discussion today, Maciej, you referenced what's going on in current events, and there are other impacts that this is having on the e-mobility industry as well. So I want to know exactly how is this impacting the industry, and what is this going to do in the coming years to the industry?
I suppose we've got to start with the negatives, because there are plenty of them, and that's what's happening in Ukraine is purely horrible, and it's even difficult to discuss how it's going to affect automotive industry, because right now it's affecting people in general, and they're losing their lives, they're losing their homes, and that's really happening. I'm from Poland. We are a part of European Union, but still it's happening just next to us, and it's kind of really horrible feeling. And we're trying to support many families from Ukraine, but still it's a huge thing, and something that was totally unbelievable a couple of weeks ago that it can happen. So that's the first point. The second one is that you are very right that right now having electric vehicle means that you are paying less for driving 100 or 1,000 kilometers. That's very right, and maybe it's a moment that we are in a moment that in the coming weeks or coming months we'll be facing kind of a crisis that UN states faced in the 1970s, and I think that's the real case scenario here in Europe, because we are getting quite a lot of fuel, quite a lot of coal, quite a lot of gas from Russia, and obviously we do not want to do it anymore. And it's easier to say than to do, because it means that we need to take it from some other directions, and it's not so easy. It needs time to do it. So for sure, in terms just of how expensive it's gonna be to cover 100 kilometers, I suppose for a couple of months more, it's gonna be good for e-mobility. It's gonna be good for e-mobility as well, because of the fact that right now we know that it's not only about being climate neutral. It's not about the reduction of CO2 emissions, but right now it's about our safety and the fact that we should be independent. And renewables in general are giving us this kind of feeling that we are quite safe, that we are independent. So for sure, in longer term, it's gonna be good for e-mobility. As I mentioned, I suppose that it sounds maybe bad, but that's very true, that every single crisis in the last 3 years was somehow good for e-mobility at the end. COVID pandemia, semiconductor crisis, and right now what's happened in Ukraine, I suppose gives us another arguments in the discussion how fast it should be done, and what else we should do to make this change happening even faster. So but just to end with what I already said, that I think that it's pretty difficult to say what it's gonna bring in the next couple of months, because obviously supply chain will be interrupted. It is already interrupted. Some manufacturers have huge problems to be able to manufacture vehicles because of the fact that many parts are not being as accessible as they used to be. So in the coming months, I suppose it's going to be a difficult period for the whole automotive industry, but in the longer term, it's going to be good for e-mobility.
Absolutely, I absolutely agree. And to cap today's episode off, I'd like to end on a slightly more positive note. So I'd like to end with the predictions and our 2030 visions. I want you to tell me, what do you expect the market of EV chargers to look like in 2030? What's your forecast? What trend do you expect to see? Just your snapshot.
Just in Europe, we are counting those charging points in millions in 2030. Just in Poland, we are counting them in hundreds of thousands. So I suppose it's gonna be a huge market, and it's gonna be divided into ultra fast charging and normal charging. So yeah, I think that it's obvious that the market will grow much bigger, and in 2030 electric vehicles will be the ones being bought by most of European or global customers.
Okay. All right. And I'm going to turn over to you, Efra, and ask you the exact same thing. So what do you expect the market of EV chargers to look like come 2030? And what's your forecast? What trend do you expect?
Right, and I would absolutely agree with Maciej that like he said that the numbers will be very high for the EV charging market, and we do expect this decade to be really good for EV charging and electric vehicle market. So also I believe, if we quickly check the regions and see what's happening on region basis. So currently Asia Pacific is more driven by electrification in two or three countries like China, South Korea. However, we'll see increased electrification in emerging e-mobility markets, especially in Southeast Asian countries like Singapore, Thailand. Then in Europe, of course, Western Europe, I think is already quickly pacing up its speed in electrifying the countries. But then also in Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, with the plans and incentives that are now put in place, and with the price parity between the ICE and electric vehicle, once that happens, then of course in Europe as well as a whole, we will see electric vehicle technology and its charging infrastructure really increasing. And Americas as well. I think right now we see USA as leading and dominating the region as a whole, but over the years, South America and probably countries there, basically, as we discussed earlier, there are specific plans by the governments for electrifying the commercial fleet. So all of those things would make a good percentage for South American countries in by 2030 as well. So overall, I would say I expect the market of EV chargers to grow like with around 23% from 2021 to 2030, and I believe that the market will be of around 23 billion USD by 2030.
On the whole, from today's discussion, there's no doubt that it's an exciting time for EVs, and it's an exciting time to be at the forefront of the EV revolution, both as a manufacturer or innovator and as an end consumer. And we're a little ways away from making EVs the preferred vehicle type due to limitations with accessibility, affordability, range extension, delays, current events. But we're also seeing government bodies incentivizing this movement. We're seeing funding, rewards, rebates, and more. So Maciej, Efra, thank you so much for joining me today and sharing your valuable insights and analysis on what's going on in the e-mobility industry and where it's headed. It was a pleasure having you both, and it was great diving into today's discussion together.
It was a pleasure having you in this episode, and thank you so much, Maciej and Zainab.
Thank you very much, Efra.
And with that, thank you to our audience for tuning in to get the PTR perspective. This is Zainab Imran signing out. Until next time.